So in this chapter, we're going to be talking about CAD logic and the way you exercise your brain to help you adjust whether you're coming from 2D or from a polygon modeling experience. Your brain will need to adjust to thinking in CAD. And for that purpose, I'm offering you this very simple but extremely useful exercise of taking an existing hard surface prop. In this case, we're looking at a rocket launcher mock-up, and we're gonna take this, imagine that this is a 3D shape, and address this as a problem, and then we're gonna try and apply all the tools that we've learned so far, the ones that you saw in chapter 3, and we're gonna break it down and see what kind of previously learned tools we can apply to achieve these certain shapes. If you're coming from a polymodeling experience, you might be familiar with this phenomenon where once you start learning the topology and how topology is built to generate a certain shape, when you're learning that and you're looking at objects in real life, you start to see this imaginary topology and you start to build that with your brain. This is a very similar process, and because CAD is very specific in how it builds shapes. But for people who come from 2D or just learning 3D from scratch, the best analogy I can give is it's like once you understand how shapes are built, you will start to look at the world through these kind of like magic CAD glasses, and you're going to be breaking any shape you see in front of you. You mentally, in your mind, will be breaking it down. So I'm just going to show you how I usually do it. If I'm looking at this prop, the first thing I'm going to do, it's kind of a game of shapes that little kids play when you're looking at the full big shape and you're trying to break it down into smaller shapes that are easily recognizable. In this case, it's like a bunch of cylinders, and with weapon props, it's kind of popular. I mean the cylindrical shapes. So we're just gonna tone this down, take my favorite orange marker, and I'm gonna help you understand how I'm breaking down these shapes in my mind. And hopefully if you do enough of these exercises on your own, you will be able to catch up with CAD logic. So the first thing I'm paying attention to is that this is not one solid piece. It's obviously broken down into several parts. We're talking about the scope, this huge tube right here probably is going to be our main big cylinder, and then just start breaking down this whole thing into smaller and smaller components, which means technically that you will be building them separately. Maybe even this part can be a whole separate thing altogether. And in Fusion 360, it's even possible to build this with a spline, this little strap, but we're not going to worry about it. So this, and if you pay attention, the way I'm breaking it down is pretty specific, because I believe this is how it makes sense to manufacture this particular prop. So in real world, these components would be really separate. So once we identify the parts, this is exactly how we're going to approach modeling. And usually it makes sense to start with the big ones and go outward. So this is going to be like 1, doesn't really matter, but 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And you can also think about it as, and by the way, this is a close-up. I mean, this is a close-up of the bigger picture here. And you can see that the main shape of this whole weapon is pretty much a cylinder. So as I'm approaching building individual components, I can also think about them as groups, just like I was showing you in the browser. The file structure will be like this group. So this is a group, and this will be a group, and this will be a group, etc. And then this group will contain individual bodies that will all be linked together and put in the same group. So I'm just gonna, well, I guess I can keep this. I'm just gonna tone it down a little bit so it's not on the way. And then let's take one particular group, the way I'm gonna be approaching the modeling. So imagine that all the tools that we've learned in the previous chapter is our selection of tool library in our head, right? So we're looking at this shape, and the closest shape that we can find in our mind is a cube, or if we are talking about a sketch, is just a rectangle. But it's important to recognize that this whole shape can be represented or started with a cube right here. And initially when you're drawing it out, it would have been like this, but then your mind is already telling you that we've learned that chamfer, if we put a chamfer on this particular angle, at this angle, we will be able to achieve this slope. On the other hand, if we actually start from a sketch, just like I was telling you before, there's 1,000 ways to start a shape. What we can do is find a plane that's going to be just coplanar with this, right? And we're going to sketch the overall shape, which overall shape in a form of a sketch will look like this. This is not going to be present yet. We're going to cut that out. And then in this particular case, we can sketch the slope right away. So this is what our sketch is going to look like. And then so this is going to be the sketch plane. It's going to be that faded orange color, which means we will be able to take that shape and press pull it either outward or inward and give it that needed thickness right here. And then we're gonna start another sketch, and we're gonna draw another rectangle right here. And then we're gonna press pull it to make the desired depth of the cut, which, if I go back real quick, once we achieve that depth, what we're gonna see is something like that. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. So we're gonna take this edge right here and we're gonna add a fillet to the edge, which will make it rounded like that. And then we see that there's two features right here that remotely resemble cylinders, which means we're gonna create a cylinder on any of the planes. Gonna insert them right there, make them rounded by using a fillet right here, and then we're gonna merge them together, as you can see on the close-up, which these cylinders are similar to those. And once we insert that cylinder, It's going to penetrate through the geometry. It's going to be rounded on the edge. Once we combine them, we will be able to get this common edge and add a bit of a fillet to help smooth the transition. As you can see, the fillets and chamfers not only treat the edges and create shapes, they go a little beyond that, like things that you would normally kind of be hard to achieve in polymodeling, those nice transitions without subdividing. So just a couple of other examples before I break this down further. This whole shape, this is a fillet, this is a fillet, this is just a cut, either a sketch or a rectangle. And then you can see that there's a bit of a lip right here because these pieces are actually two separate pieces, and all of that on the bottom is separate. You can see the separation line. So as an example, this would be a completely new body, a new cube, and then to achieve that separation line, we're going to treat the edges with chamfers. So that's a chamfer, that's a fillet. Let's say this is definitely a cut with a cylinder, which the cylinder will go right in there, and it will be, once it's cut, we're not going to preserve it, so it's going to disappear. This bolt is an interesting case because it's easier to start that bolt as a cylinder first. So it's going to be a cylinder. We don't need really, like for if you're not planning to break this down, we don't need to worry about the stem. So it's only going to be the head of the cylinder, and then we're going to use a coplanar face somewhere here just to look at this bolt from the side, and we're going to make this cut. So we're going to just use a cube that's going to be intersecting, and it will create that cut. And every time you see a problem like this, you're basically looking at something that definitely has a way to be solved using the tools. Your task as a designer is to go back to your imaginary tool library, find the right tool, and or maybe a combination of tools, and see how it can be applied. Just a couple of more examples. You can see this label, definitely easier done starting with a sketch. So we're going to start a sketch on this coplanar face again, where a lot of things are easier done from blockouts first without making the rounded stuff. So it's going to be done in this fashion, just straight edges first, and then these corners will receive proper fillets, and then this is going to be two circular sketches. And then if this looks kind of more like it's cut in, you can do slice face, slice body. You can turn this into a tool and kind of use this whole face to slightly push it inside and make a little bit of a cut to achieve this lip that you can see here in black. Let's take a look at a couple more examples in a different area. Like this is a good example. This seems like this face was built, first of all, just a straight up a square with these corners having a fillet on it. But then you can see that this is all sorts of openings are clearly a Boolean operation. All you need to do is sketch this out. and then once it turns into a face, which there is a very useful tool for this kind of shape. This tool is called a slot, but it can also be achieved from a rectangle with filleted edges. In reality, if you're trying to save time or trying to be very precise, which is the right way to go, you can see that there's an axis of symmetry here, which there's actually two. This whole thing is symmetrical both ways. It's symmetrical vertically, horizontally, and vertically. So really, you only need to sketch this part to save yourself time and to be more precise. And then you're gonna use the mirror, and this is a mirror as well. Now, stuff like this, a lot of times, if you're a concept artist, it doesn't make sense to solve this geometry inside of Fusion, even though you can. If you want to know a way, I would say I would do this using a sketch. First of all, this whole face, as I see it, is not flat. If we do a drawing from the side, I think it looks something more like this, so it's a little bit rounded. And then this is a side profile of this whole thing, and so it's basically kind of like this. And then I would just use sketch lines to create the intersections. Then I will select the needed faces and cut them out. Or in reality, I only need to create one line of tools that will help me create the openings, and then I will use square pattern depending on what works best for me, and then I will just say that we want to pattern this whole face. Now let's take a look at something also pretty familiar to us, adding this kind of, like these kind of knobs and stuff. Obviously this is a cylinder with another cylinder. You start seeing that all of the things have pretty simple shapes in hard surface. And then once you learn the simple shapes, of course you can go much more complicated. And then you can see that this whole cylinder has a pattern to help grip the knob better, which looks like, guess what, it's another cylinder. So we're gonna add this to the body. We will not gonna merge it. We need to keep this separate. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This is gonna be radial symmetry with 8 pieces. And then after that, we're gonna merge everything together. Control C, Control V this, move it into here. The benefits of manufacturing is that you only really need to build one thing, and then you can propagate it throughout. So once you build some sort of a bolt or something like that, you're just gonna copy this around. This is an interesting shape because it's actually easier achieved from a sketch. What's possible to do is, once you're on this plane right here, you're just gonna define the contour. So you're gonna draw a spline or a sketch line that's gonna mimic the contour. Then you're gonna draw the center axis. So this is gonna be the profile. And then you're gonna use revolve tool that's gonna revolve this whole face alongside this axis and turn this into this black body that we have at the end. And then just you're attaching another cylinder, adding more detail, spotting another radial symmetry here. Just gonna clean this up real quick. So this whole piece can be built separately somewhere on the side if you want. Again, complicated profiles like this are much easier sketched first. So we're gonna start with a plane, sketch out this profile, sketch out the smaller profile, kind of like punch them out, press pull them, and a lot of stuff is built like this. Again, another case of radial symmetry. In this case, we're gonna have a cylinder that could have been cut away or started from two cylinders merged together, bigger cylinder next to a smaller cylinder, then adding a chamfer here. And then we're only going to build one of the features, and then we're going to make a radial symmetry out of it. Stuff like this that help, they cut, the stuff like this cuts away from the shapes. Sometimes it serves the purpose of making the construction lighter. Sometimes it's just to allow for a certain movement without parts intersecting. This is clearly a sketch that's going to be just pushed into the main shape. So you can see that, well, let's break down the scope real quick as well, why not? Again, is anytime you see basically like a vase type of shape, easier to do with the body with revolving. This is the axis. This is the profile of the revolve. Revolve that around. Boom. Before you get done with this, basically lots of chamfers happening here, making it rounder, treating the edges. I would say just like this pattern here, this pattern doesn't have to be sculpted and doesn't have to be represented with actual geometry unless it's a requirement. A lot of times, if you're rendering in a keyshot, this can just be done with a bump map. But again, it all depends on how far you want to push the actual high poly model. You can see that the eyesight has a cut in of a cylinder with a little bolt in there. Again, easier started with just a cube, this whole shape, and then this edge here and here will be receiving a fillet, which will make it rounder. A bunch of cylinders, a bunch of cylinders, a bunch of cylinders. Let's just take a look at a slightly different view of the same thing. You can see that once you know your tools, you can clearly see how it is applied in real world. And technically, all of these things used to be CAD drawings. So if you don't see a solution right away, you just need to be a little more creative about it. Just wanted to give you an example of this interesting piece right here. It was basically a cylinder at one point that was merged in, kind of like moved into the main body of this box, and then it was merged together, so using combine in a additive fashion, which will give us this common edge right here. And you can see how smooth is the blending. So basically we're just going to be adding a fillet here, because if you're looking at edges, not only fillets can be added to smooth edge out, which this will be the shape, but also fillets can be used, this is the shape, to smooth the edge out the other way, which, if you know, it's a little bit of a new concept for some of students. So you can see that we didn't have any problem breaking down this piece of weapon that kind of seems complicated, but it only looks complicated because it consists of several parts. Each of those parts is actually not that hard to do. A lot of things are achieved through Boolean operations, just like those holes in there. All of this is technically a Boolean operation. So what we're going to do from here is we're going to jump into lesson 2, and we're going to build a small prop, something that would be an equivalent of this scope, literally we're going to be doing the same type of breakdown, but this time we're going to be actually modeling.